To start, to welcome everybody to Virtual Coffee Club, and start with a land acknowledgement. I'm a fourth generation European settler with distant Métis ancestry, and I'm humbled by the opportunity to live, work, and grow as a person on Treaty 4 territory, the homeland of the Métis. And as a programs and volunteer coordinator at the Western Development Museum, I would like to recognize the diversity of Indigenous people and continue to rebuild our relationship through reconciliation initiatives. So our speaker today is Annie Battiste. She is a Mi'kmaq woman and a member of the Potloteck First Nation, and is deeply committed to advancing social justice and fostering reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. With a diverse skill set encompassing public speaking, cultural competency, program development, and strategic planning, Annie holds a bachelor's and master's in education from the University of Saskatchewan. As an educator at heart, she has embraced her passion with her new role as assistant professor in the Innu Studies at Cape Breton University. Annie's professional journey is firmly rooted in the principles of anti-racism, teaching about Indigenous people's history in Canada, and unwavering commitment to reconciliation as a guiding force in all of her endeavors. So I'll pass the floor to Annie to start her presentation.
Lovely. Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to share my screen and we will be off and running. Slideshow, play from start. Well, welcome and thank you for joining me today. And today is going to be a short chat about a very complex subject. Usually we could spend up to two, maybe 3 hours kind of talking and then kind of unpacking and unrooting ourselves, our histories, and how do we get to this kind of new narrative on this idea of land acknowledgements, or treaty acknowledgements, depending on what you call it. But we're here for a little short period of time. And so I'm going to throw a whole bunch of facts at you. And then we're going to have some moments to kind of, think about our own, and then, maybe have some conversation or questions that kind of come from this that might be percolated. So you can ask questions throughout in the chat throughout this. I don't see it. It doesn't show up in my world, so I will deal with them when I stop sharing screen, and we can go through them and answer the questions. So feel free, if you are the person who kind of in the moment needs to, ask the question or you forget it, please do. Just know I'm not going to stop the presentation, or maybe I will, depending, but I doubt I normally don't see any of the toolbar. So today, we are talking about treaties and land acknowledgement right before September 30th for the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, which is a important day that looks at the truth of residential school survivors, which we're not going to talk about today, but it is an important component of. And really the essence of the day is to look at residential school survivors who around this time, around September 30th, the planes, the trains, the boats, the peoples, the RCMP, the social workers would come into communities and take children and take them to residential school against the will of their parents and community members. So it is important to reflect on that, but that's not where we are going to go today. So just as a precursor and something important to do when you are listening to a presenter is to figure out who they are, where they come from, what is their learning, what is their knowledge, and what is their perspective on land acknowledgements. There is no right way, wrong way to do a land acknowledgement, but it encompasses a lot of personal conversations and personal identities. It connects to land that your feet are, situated on right now. And it talks hopefully about your commitment or reconciliation that is moving in your organization or in your personal space, community, religion, whatever it is. So in the introduction, I was introduced lovingly, but my name is Annie Battiste. I am a namesake to my maternal grandmother, who's in the picture in the bottom left, and my grandfather as well on my maternal side. I also am a Mi'kmaq woman, which is a First Nations group that is situated in the East Coast. In where I'm right now is in Sydney, Nova Scotia, which is in the Cape Breton Island, which is also known as Unama'ki, and that one of the 7 districts of the Mi'kma'ki that is in English called Land of the Fog. And so my feet are planted right now in Unama'ki, and my next slide will talk about, kind of more land acknowledgement, but I also am an educator by trade. So I have a bachelor's of education, a master's in education, and 10 years of experience talking about reconciliation and land acknowledgements. I also have a Chickasaw father and a father who has been in the law world. He's now retired, but also frames how I think about land acknowledgements, and I talk about rights-based reconciliation. And so, so of course, we can't start the day without really a good protocol of place. And this is situating yourself in space. And that is a land acknowledgement, is you're situating yourself in this space. You're acknowledging your protocols of place. For Indigenous people, this is something that they've done, since the, creation stories, as they have always noted who they belong to, where they are, whose land they're on. Are they a visitor on this territories? Did their ancestors, live on this territory? Did they family sign peace and friendship treaties? Or no, sorry, that's in Nova Scotia. Did your family sign treaties? This is all really important components to place ourselves in the moment and really talk about the relationship that exists between land, between communities, and the history of, and legacy of really bad things that happen to Indigenous people that have created systems and sectors that, we need to talk about. So before I get too deep into my slides and get lost, I do want to acknowledge that it's important that thinking about land acknowledgement is where your feet are planted. A lot of people get lost in provinces or Canada or all these things. But when you're thinking about your land acknowledgement, it is what is under your feet. What is your feet touching? You can have connections to other treaties and that stuff, but when you're talking and situating yourself, you should really speak to whatever land you are on at that moment and whose lived experiences have been on that land. For me right now, that is, my feet are planted in the traditional territory called Unama'ki in Mi'kma'ki. And Mi'kma'ki means the place where all Mi'kmaq are. And it's mostly Atlantic Canada, and then down into the States. This is the ancestral territory of the Mi'kmaq Nation that's protected under the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1726, and then renewed again in 1752, and then renewed again in 1760 and 1761, due largely because there was conflict that arose, and issues that happened, and they had to renew their treaty relationship, or they added new people, both on the settler side or the First Nation side. They would add more people, or they would add now a governor, or now the premier, or now, all these. So they were renewed for those very reasons. So before you can really talk about a land acknowledgement or talk about the importance of a land acknowledgement, you have to think a little bit about, do you know what a treaty is? And at the end of the day, and it's synthesized, boiled down, treaties are an agreement between 2 sovereign nations. Now, these 2 sovereign nations being sovereign, saying that they don't have anyone telling them that they have to get along or that they have to do things, are 2 sovereign groups that make an agreement on how they're going to live on that land together. Now, this isn't necessarily an Indigenous specific thing. There is treaties that exist in many Europe nations that look at the Treaty of Versailles, the Treaty of Utrecht. There's many ways in which sovereign nations made agreements on how to live on the land together. That is, what was taken and brought to Canada, or the new lands, if you want to call it, to create treaties. Now, Canada has over 300 treaties, and it's growing, every year with modern day treaties. So it is really important that we understand the land that you're on and what that means. In many spaces, there is space for both parties, both First Nation and settlers, about what were the rules and responsibilities, the provisions, the promises, the spirit and intent. as well as they were always supposed to be seen as current. And they were supposed to be understood not as a historical document, but really as the kind of modern day treaty implementation that we should be going through today. And it is permanent as well. Now, there's multiple treaties in Canada that exist. And for everyone who's joining me, the 26 participants joining me, you could very well be in peace and friendship treaties like myself, numbered treaties. You could be in modern treaties up north. There's many ways in which you can exist with treaties in Canada. This is not a pan-Canadian treaty conversation. But is more specific to kind of Saskatchewan, where I don't talk about peace and friendship treaties as much when I'm in my next slides. But I try to keep it a little bit closer to the Western Development Museum area. And it's important that you understand that there is multiple layers of treaties that exist on the land. And so there's not just one right way to say a treaty land acknowledgement, depending on if they're Indigenous and the relationships, intertribal treaties, depending on the peace and friendship that there was existing, depending on the different numbered treaties or modern treaties, they can be added to, or there could be many treaties. In Ontario, there's a lot of times when there's multiple treaties, including intertribal treaties, like the Dish with One Spoon is also has another treaty, I think, and another treaty on top of that because of the overlap. So there isn't one right answer, but in the numbered treaties, it's a little bit easier because there is kind of more of these big spaced treaties where the treaty commissioner came in and with the responsibility of the Queen came in and had these conversations. And so most people can say Treaty 4, Treaty 6, but if you hear Treaty 6A or 17A or Treaty of 1752, 1726, note that that's all correct. It's encompassing a greater area of treaties that exist. Now, for most talks and most conversations around treaties, we need to acknowledge what benefits or perceived benefits the treaties were supposed to give in the numbered treaty area. And this is really important because to do a land acknowledgement when you personally don't really understand what A is your responsibility and B, what is the promises and the benefits you're getting is really a difficult one to navigate then what is your responsibilities. So for First Nations, I put perceived benefits because a lot of this was largely ignored for the Indian Act that had really historical abuse of policies and human rights violations. But these were the things that were supposed to be given. And I think a lot of advocacy and conversations have had it so that become a lot of treaty rights has become in the for conversation of a lot of rights-based knowledge. But, for First Nations people, they were excited about learning new skills brought by the settler. That is not to say that they wanted to give up their land, they wanted to give up their education, they wanted to give up their governance, but what they saw was opportunities to learn new skills. Reading, was something that was not needed by First Nations as they were an oral tradition people that had hieroglyphs, syllabics, and all these different things. But, the idea of their writing system intrigued a lot of the First Nation chiefs. You can read about this in the Treaty Right to Education. I think it's Sheila Carr Stewart has one, and it's called the Right to Education, Treaty Right to Education. And it really shows some quotes and some ideas about what was the interest of First Nations in education. Another thing that they wanted to do is you have to always remember the historical context that was in the space, which was that there was already 6 or 7 language groups who practiced different ceremonies, practiced different histories, practiced different, all sorts of different kind of knowledges. And so having another group come in just was a good idea to maintain peace and good order with all peoples. And that relationship building was paramount to kind of peace and good order for a First Nations. Now, of course, if you read Clearing the Plains or you read other books, I think one's by Sarah Carter, you would know that, there was a lot of really negative things that happened. But really, it was the intent of the treaty was for the First Nations side was to maintain peace and good order. There was also a promise of an enriched livelihood, and this is the word of maintenance of their livelihood. And this was something that was said in the treaties that said, like, you don't have to stop hunting. You don't have to stop fishing. You can maintain these. You can continue your traditional ways. We're not interfering. But if you need help, if you want us, if there is something that you want to tag us into to help you, please do. And, they said that through the medicine chest in Treaty 6, the pestilence and famine in Treaty 6, as well as, the schoolhouse, when the reserve shall allow it or want it. All these things were when the First Nations wanted it, not ever to completely, obliterate their way of being for a new form. As well as food security. Of course, we all know about the buffalo that was, 7 generations forward. They were getting worried that there might not be the buffalo. Now, for benefits, before I use the word perceived benefits, and now I use the word benefits of treaties for settlers, was the Queen had, peaceful access for lands to take up for farming or railways. John A. Macdonald was really big on a railway. And so that was one of the things that the Queen was kind of working towards, having space for the government or, different areas like that. Now, when I say lands taken up, I don't mean sold. I don't mean bought. I don't mean surrendered. I don't mean ceded. All I mean is that First Nations said you can, build up, your whatever you need to survive, a government, a fort, whatever, you can use those lands in these spaces. But there was no land surrender. There was no land, exchange. And I think that was a big myth for a really long time about treaties, that it had to do some with, us selling land for goods. And a part of our worldview and our knowledge system all don't understand land as a purchasable commodity, but really as a animate land that they have responsibility to. And Supreme Court has ruled that that understanding of buying and surrendering of land, it was null and void and was not something that happened through the treaties. Another thing that most people on this call probably would be a strong benefit to settlers, that maintained, was peaceful settlement in the West for future generations. If you are not a person who has come to this land in your lifetime, you are a multi-generation settler who have lived on this land for multi-generations because of the beauty of treaties saying that as long as there was peace and friendship and good order, that settlers could be on this land as long as they wanted. In multiple generations. And so if you own a farm and it's been in your family for the last 3-4 years, 3-4 generations, that is a benefit of, and that is a thing that you benefit off the treaties for. Of course, there was also prevention of costly and deathly wars with First Nations people, prevention from American expansion. And a part of the treaties was that the First Nations agreed to fight on behalf of Canada, or what is now being called Canada. And that was a big conversation because then a lot of people backed down in trying to kind of settle and do American expansion or trying to start wars with First Nations people because they were going to fight on behalf of Canada. It's also why we have a huge number of Indigenous people in the military, is why we had huge numbers that went into World War I and II, and veterans, because they had that belief of the treaties that they had to fight on behalf of Canada. Now, that's important stuff to think about when you're beginning to percolate your land acknowledgement. And land acknowledgements are the first step in the stepping stone in rebuilding the treaty relationship. In honesty, they're not a lot. They're not, they're the first step you can do in a spectrum of what needs to be done through organizations and individuals, but it's a good start. Now, if you don't say them, it's noticed, but I think now it's become quite tokenistic to use it because people don't really use land acknowledgements in the way that I think they were intended kind of in 2015 and forward, as being this kind of placid wording that we use. And, even to shudder, the worst thing I find is that when people read it, and I know that it's a learning, and I know that it is something that you have to learn, but I feel like once we get and understand the core concepts of what we talk about, It doesn't matter how you say it specifically if you are honoring the concepts of what you need to bring up. And so today I'm going to talk to you about chunks, things you can add, things you can take away, because I don't believe there's a right way to say or not say a land acknowledgement as long as you understand why you're saying them. So land acknowledgements can be simple or complex. If you are in a space where you're having difficulty, memorizing a treaty acknowledgement, maybe make it simple. When it's simple and you understand your core concepts you're saying, then you can make it more complicated. But to make it complex and to make a really nice one that you can't memorize and that you have to read off, kind of takes away from the authenticity of the thing, even though I know your hearts are in good places and you want to do it justice. But think about that a little bit, and find your spectrum of where this exists. If you're writing a document, go complex. If you're an MC, and you're uncomfortable, go simple. Whatever you need to do to be able to honor and authentically talk about land the way that it should. Now, I put these in Alberta, but in Saskatchewan and Alberta, because you're both in Treaty 6, it is, well, some of you are in Treaty 6. Most of the Western Development is in 2, 4, I think 8 and 10. But the basic land acknowledgement that has been done in Saskatchewan and has been done, and you probably have heard it 1,000 times, depending on where you are, is I want to acknowledge that we're on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis, or Treaty 4 territory in the homeland of the Métis. That's become, universities have used that. There's been lots of conversations, and it's in its core good. If you are using the term treaty and the number that you're actually in, territory, and recognizing the lived experience of other people on that territory that have had different relationships outside of treaty, then you're doing a great job. But there's more nuances than, just that. So, Treaty 6, 7, and 8 in the homeland of the Métis, the shared lands of Treaty 6, 7, and 8. If you're, when you talk about the homeland of the Métis, you're talking about land. When you talk about the home of the Métis Nation, you're talking about systems and governance and, and political. When you're talking about the home of the Michif, you're talking about language. So there's ways to honor the lived experience of Métis people depending on what is an area you're talking to or who you're talking to. I know a lot of elders, Métis elders who say, I'm not Métis, I'm Michif. So, say home of the Michif. I know a lot of people who say, when I'm in more political settings, I'll say home of the Métis Nation to honor the governance and independence and sovereignty of the Métis Nation. Are any of those right or wrong? No. It's about nuance. It's about context. It's about understanding the core concept and being able to amalgamate it when you're in different spaces. And that's what I was talking about earlier, about understanding the core concepts of what you're speaking to, because then you'll be able to better understand why you're using the words that you're doing, instead of just saying this is what the university uses. Now, there's also many places that have already created treaty land acknowledgements for you to look at. You can go to whose land, .ca, native land, OTC has maps. COUT has already created university acknowledgements. Organizations and leaders in your community, just listen to what they say and think about and perplex the different concepts that are created with what they're saying. And those are all the ways to do it. You don't have to recreate the wheel. And this is very much something that most places have percolated. I will say though, I do this quite a lot, and 15% of the time, there's a stumping question because it's in between two different treaties and we have to go, I have to talk to an elder or something, but most of it is pretty straightforward. Now, when I talked about earlier in the slide was this notion of Treaty 6 territory and discussing lived experience of other peoples on this land that were not a part of treaty or are a part of treaty. But that idea also encompasses, it starts with Métis, or, is a good start with Métis, but there is also a whole First Nations section that have their own traditional territory lands, and they use it for ceremony. And they, some people bring them up, and you'll hear people say the Cree, the Dene, the Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and the Saulteaux. Those are terms other people have chosen for those tribes. Like in First Nations in Mi'kmaq, that was what was said to us, and that it says who we are. But we use the word Olnu as we're the people, or to designate our First Nations understanding of ourselves. You'll see that here too with, I put, Cree, but I also put Nehiau, or Nehithau, or Nehinau, or Nakaway, or Denesulin, or Oseti Sakuin. Those are, and I could have butchered all of those as I don't speak any of those languages. I'm a Mi'kmaq speaker. But it's important that, you can think about, do I want to, honor, and my part of reconciliation is about utilizing First Nations languages, then you might want to use Nehiau and Nakaway and all those words. If that's scary, if that feels like, panic attack vibes, you can say Cree, you can say Dene, you can say Saulteaux, you know what I mean? It's just your comfortability about honoring the lived experiences. I know some people also will say something, and I think maybe was said in your land acknowledgement, is you kind of do a collective Indigenous peoples, conversation, which is kind of a beginning start in that conversation. If you're feeling like I'm overwhelmed, a lot of people say, and I recognize the many nations that have Indigenous nations that have lived on this land as well, and have called it home, or something like that. So those are important things just to think about when you're adding to the core concepts. You have the treaty territory, you have the different lived experiences on that land, Métis, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Saulteaux. And then you get into what is the responsibilities in this. And I find this is where you need to really think about your organization. And I know that usually it's handed down to you in kind of a, this is the land acknowledgement you use, change it, your email, do all this stuff, but don't really tell people why it's important or what it means. And so a lot of people add organizational responsibilities. I'm just using the Western Development Museum because it's, Western Development Museum, WDM affirms our commitment to recognizing the historical and ongoing harms. WDM affirm and commit to honor and spirit and intent of the treaties, or WDM commits to reconciliation and the calls to action. And here's where it gets a little tokenistic and a little, in the hard part is the question has to be how. A lot of time people say to me, like, we affirm or we commit to reconciliation. I said, well, how do you commit to reconciliation? And organizations will say, like, well, we, are in a beginning journey. I said, well, then maybe that's the space and time to be honest in this land acknowledgement about where your organization is. It's not necessarily a bad thing. If you say you don't do anything, then, maybe that's problematic. But what you should think about is the words you're using. They sound beautiful to affirm and commit to these things, but if you have no infrastructure, no budget, no, nothing in your organization that actually does that, then you're really not helping yourself in land acknowledgement. So for a lot of times I tell people, be honest in your organizational responsibility. We are on a learning journey. We have, we are working towards committing reconciliation through, advisory circles and histories and working with elders. Be mindful and honest about really your reflection as what your organization is doing. Now, you probably say, but like my boss picked it out or my board of directors. And I think it is important for your boards of directors to outline why they picked those words. And I believe in briefing documents that unpack each component of your land acknowledgement and speaks to what WDM is picking and why it picked those words. And really push back on staff and board of directors and anyone who does land acknowledgements to keep it as almost a learning document or a toolkit or a briefing document, instead of just copy paste this and put it on your website, or copy paste this, put it on your emails. And the last thing I want to talk about, because I am a little bit over time here and I want to give some time for questions, is an importance of your personal relationship. If you ask me what moves reconciliation or land acknowledgement forward, is I'm always confused because I told you that land acknowledgements are about your personal relationship with the land, your personal relationship with communities, your personal relationship with our history and legacies of our history. But yet 60% of the time I hear land acknowledgements that have nothing to do with individuals. They say, I want to acknowledge that, I'm on Treaty 6 territory in the Métis homeland, and this organization is doing blah, 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 which is fine, but that's not the intent of a land acknowledgement. The intent of a land acknowledgement is to acknowledge your personal relationship on this land. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to get into like your 5th generation ancestor, in a meeting. It just means that you need to think about how you see yourself on this land, and reflect on how you benefit from treaty and what it means in your own life to do reconciliation. So a few examples I have down here is, as a 3rd generation settler, is something you could say, which I heard Alexa say, or some generation settler, is just to say, I'm here on this land. How did I connect to this land? It could be longer as a 3rd generation settler whose ancestors were given lands that displaced the Cree people. I have a responsibility to ... Recognizing that I'm a 2nd generation Ukrainian farming family that were humbled by the opportunity to live, grow, and work in this territory. Or I acknowledge I'm a visitor on this territory, having come from the United States with the Chickasaw peoples being the traditional territories. As a newcomer to this territory, my traditional people are ... And this is going to be as short as you want, and to just say, I recognize that I'm a settler on this territory. I have benefits of treaty from the treaty relationship, and move on or whatever. And this is a really important one because it places people back into the idea of land and back into an Indigenous idea, worldview, or paradigm. Is how do we connect to the land? So that's something else to think about when you're doing it. The best case scenario for me for a land acknowledgement would be like, hi, welcome. My name is Annie. I'm a 3rd generation settler living on this land. I've had the honor of having multi-generation farming that worked alongside Indigenous people. And, I recognize that our meeting is taking place today on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis, Cree, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, Saulteaux. And I'm, excited that we're continuing this conversation on reconciliation. Now I made that up, on the spot, but once you see the core concepts, you don't have to say the same thing every time. And I think that's a really big fear people have, is that you have to say it exactly the same time every way, or it's wrong. But once you know the core concepts of how it exists, you can say it many different ways. I'll go to meetings, and if a lot of people have done their land acknowledgement, I'll just be like, I consider myself a visitor on the Treaty 6 territory, as my traditional peoples are from Nova Scotia. That's my land acknowledgement. It's connecting me to this land. And if you say, oh, I'm so bored at staff meetings because everyone says the same thing, then they're not connecting themselves to the land, and they're not connecting their responsibilities to the land. They're doing Treaty 6 territory and the Métis homeland, which is very tokenistic kind of way to do it if you don't involve it into self and your relationship with the land. Now, with that, just a few tips and tricks. Use personal and important language. Use language that you would use. If you use the words genocide or supremacy casually, use those in your words, in your land acknowledgement. If you don't, use other words. If you're poetic, you can choose to flourish it out. I have a friend who would say, where many footsteps have walked before, what I mean? They, created their own space in it. Use past, present, and future tenses. Sometimes we inherently will consider Indigenous people of the past. So, saying, I recognize the harms that Indigenous people experienced in Canada. Well, experienced and still experience in Canada. lands, language, and culture that was exterminated, lands, language, and culture that is still resilient and still happening through many hardships of policies and systems. The historical land of Indigenous peoples, the historical and current lands of Indigenous people. And so you can see the difference that people probably are doing it and don't know they're doing it, but they place us in the past. They place their responsibility in the past. They say, that happened, but it's still happening. Treaties are a current ideology of what we should be moving towards. And then also just be honest about the history of this land. I find that sometimes people just kind of gloss over all the bad, which I understand why, but be honest. Thank you to the generous Indigenous peoples for letting us live on this land. That's a nice sentiment, but that's not true of what happened. It is that Indigenous people are generous, but we had no say in land because we were considered wards of the state through the Indian Act. And so, although I understand the intent to honor us, sometimes we maybe too gloss over the hard truths a little bit too hard, which really might inadvertently offend. And it's something to think about because, were we generous or were we put on reserves in order to commodify lands? Sometimes we just need to be a little bit more honest than it exists.
Thank you, Annie, so much. And thank you for everybody attending. And we will send out the presentation. Thanks for joining our virtual coffee club.